Welcome to VCR, Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
I'm not afraid of death, but I am afraid of murder. Oh.
Wow.
Wow.
What a sizzling quote from the movie The Conversation.
It's funny, we were actually just talking, there's not really any, super memorable quotes in this movie called The Conversation, but I was like, oh yeah, there's that one.
So, The Conversation, a movie from 1974 this is the deep dive, so if you've never seen this movie and you probably haven't, go back and check the spoiler-free primer episode where we talk about whether this movie is for you or not. Otherwise, we're going to spoil this 50-year-old movie that was nominated for Best Picture alongside The Godfather Part 2, which we're going to talk about next week.
Wow, did you take a breath at all during that?
I did not. I still haven't taken a breath yet.
Okay, Jesus. Maybe we should pause.
I might be having a stroke right now.
That happens to me during teaching sometimes. They're like, like my students like, Jesus Christ.
I thought I was on a roll, honestly.
Yeah, and I'm like, I'm crushing it up here.
Oh my God, I don't think he's breathed.
You know what's funny? My students have to do a presentation next week, and I was counseling them. I'm like, make sure you pause and take a full breath after every sentence. In the back of my head, I'm like, I never do that though, so I can't really mark you down too much for that.
Nice. So The Conversation.
Let's have a conversation.
And again, this is the deep dive. We're talking full spoilers here. I'm gonna get right into it. And I guess maybe we circle back to the question that you asked me last week. Do I like Harry Crane? Jesus Christ. How do we both mess this up
Not so
now?
easy, is it, Blake?
Yeah, Harry Call. Oh my God, Harry Crane's from Mad Men. Not even like a main character.
I just heard Crane, and I was like, you mean like Professor Crane from the Scarecrow? Yeah.
No, Harry Call. So the question you asked me last week was, do you like Harry Call? And I guess to unpackage that question, I think where I start with is, do I think that this movie does an effective job of showing me who Harry Call is as a person?
Yes.
Absolutely. I think that this movie does a character study better than most movies do.
I would say you are skin to skin with Harry the whole movie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You are just following this guy around, all his weird nuances, all his idiosyncrasies, all his neuroses, you spend some time with this poor guy.
Yeah, and credit to Gene Hackman for portraying that, and also credit to Francis Ford Coppola for being able to explain this character to him and also direct this performance and capture this performance in this way.
Yeah, and I'll say he, on the surface, he's not a particularly sexy or remarkable type character, right?
Right.
Again, he's a slightly stocky older gentleman. He's bald. Middle-aged, yeah.
He just looks old because it's the 70s.
Yeah, that's true. And he seems exceptionally good at his job, but his personal life is a mess. And again, he's very, very defensive about people asking him questions he doesn't want to answer, which is, I guess, just all questions.
Yeah. When you look at this, when you really look at Harry, he's kind of a paradox because he's considered one of the best surveillance experts in the entire country. He's almost afraid of himself in a way, it feels like. He's kind of afraid of the power that he's able to wield.
Yeah, there's definitely something like that. He seems very humble and shy and all that stuff, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a point in time when, when we get to the scene where they're at the surveillance convention and everybody recognizes him, there's one guy who's just hyping him up as oh, he was in New York with me and he captured something that nobody else could capture. And Harry's even a little hesitant to talk about it because what ended up happening was 3 people actually died during the event.
That's his tragic backstory, is that he handed over, I think it was some accountant or some shit was stealing money from some dude. So he handed over the audio file proving it, and then the accountant and his wife and child were found murdered afterwards.
Right.
So maybe a mob hit or some shit like that, right? The question I had for the first 45 minutes of this movie was, who does this guy work for? The FBI? Interpol? What is this?
He's private. He's a private contractor.
And then at some point he finally says, I'm private for surveillance. And you're just oh, so he's a private investigator, essentially.
So, and not to completely derail this conversation, but on a bit of a tangent here, I did find it really interesting. And this is kind of one of the ideas that kind of started to bounce around in my head, especially when you're talking about this now, where you were is he a private contractor? Who does this guy work for? I thought that this movie was really interesting in the sense that, it's all about surveillance and mass surveillance and like contract surveillance and everything. It just started to get me thinking about like the US and Russia, like how they've kind of maintained surveillance over their population especially over the Cold War period.
Yeah.
And how like compare and contrast the two of them, right? Because like the Soviet Union was like really notorious for the secret police and like everybody was always being surveilled and like
the KGB.
Yeah, the KGB, and like, you even watch like something like Chernobyl, and when characters are trying to have important conversations, they might be like turning up the radio or like trying to get out in the open to have this conversation away from any prying ears kind of thing.
Well, and in some ways this movie, despite maybe how certain things about it haven't aged so well, like it's almost become more relevant and like in terms of like
scarily relevant.
Yeah, like in terms of like, I remember one time you and I were talking about something and then I immediately went on my phone and there were ads for that thing, right?
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah, right? Like we are constantly being monitored, more so now than ever, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, thinking about all of that, I was like, in the US, the same sort of stuff was kind of going on, but as always, the US is more capitalistic, so it's always private ventures who are doing this kind of work for money, and that, the people who can afford to have this kind of surveillance taking place are the ones paying for this surveillance. And it's all like run by these small individual businesses who kind of have that like degree of separation from the people that they're working for.
Right, where it's like the government's being like, we don't do that. We just pay private contractors to get their hands dirty. You know what I mean?
So this was, I don't know, that all of that and all of that thought and making me think about that, like that was part of the reason why I think that this movie kind of captured my attention, was because all of that stuff started crossing my mind while I was watching it. And obviously, like, because this movie is so heavily, about surveillance and mass surveillance and like the implications of that and like how that's changed over the years and become like you said, it's like, it's so commonplace. Like we're both sitting beside our phones effectively right now, and our phones are listening into these conversations that we're having in order to sell us random shit.
Just stupid shit that we don't even want, right? Yeah. Well, it's funny. I remember when the vaccine shit was going around during the pandemic, and people were like, I don't want to get the vaccine. Like, Bill Gates is going to microchip me. And I remember, like, making this joke where I'm like, Bill Gates doesn't need to fucking microchip you. You have a phone in your pocket.
Yeah,
right?
Or a smart TV, a smart microwave.
Right, like, it's funny, too. I remember having a conversation with someone, like, a couple of summers ago where we were talking shit about the government, and immediately the Alexa just randomly went off, and we were both like, So
I'm gonna have this conversation outside in the woods.
Yeah. So like if in another week I come back to record our next podcast episode, I'm like, hello, Comrade Blake. I am your friend Michael.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too, because if you made this movie now, it would all be like, it'd be tech bro shit, right?
Yeah.
Be like hacking your phone, hacking your computer. Like, it's funny, some of the gadgets they show off at this trade show with the other surveillance experts almost border on like Looney Tunes at times, where it's like,
and then almost in a quaint way too.
Yeah,
right?
Where it's like, yeah, this is how I got it, right?
Yeah.
There's a scene like later on when Harry's in a hotel room and he's trying to figure out what's going on in the next room, and he like literally just like drills a hole in the wall and sticks like a recording device in it.
Yeah.
And part of me was like, well, yeah, what else would you do?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I'll say that like when Harry's working are some of like the most compelling parts of the movie. Like, this is kind of goes back to when we were talking about Repo Man and like how just watching all these Repo Men go about their day is really fascinating to watch. Like,
yeah,
it's the same thing with Harry, like especially when we're in the room, and like obviously at that point in time, like that's the height of the excitement of the movie is when he's gone to investigate whether the murder's happening or not. It's really exciting watching him work. On the flip side of like Harry Call, and I don't even remember why I wanted to do this tangent.
Well, we were talking about if we liked him or not.
Yeah, no, that's where I'm coming back to. I just don't remember why I wanted to go on that tangent. But anyway, the first act is spent very deeply getting into Harry's personal life.
Mm-hmm. Or lack thereof.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating that Harry is basically the opposite of who he is in his professional life, because, he's somebody who, that prostitute, I'm just going to say she's probably a prostitute that he's going and seeing.
It is kind of funny. Amy, her name's Amy, when she's like, she's quite a bit younger than he is, and she's quite a bit better looking than he is, and like part of me was like, and again, like she's being very sweet and like very nice to him.
Right.
And he's like kind of rebuffing all of her efforts, right? Like he's very unwilling to like take his armor off around her.
Right.
So it's kind of funny. I was like, why is this, young woman putting up with this old fart? And then at one point he's like, here's your rent for the next month. I'm like, oh, there it is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Hey, young men, here's a pro tip. Just offer to pay her rent.
No, that's how prostitution works.
Oh, shit. This episode should be called Michael Accidentally Discovers Prostitution.
That whole scene is really interesting because of like the dynamic there of that relationship, but it's the way he interacts with her. Like he pauses at the top of the stairs, and then all of everything that she's talking about. Like you talk about how sweet it is that she seems to somewhat actually care about him, and like she's talking about how she used to be excited to like hear him coming down the steps. But like a lot of that conversation, what I was focused on was her saying like, I can hear you. Like you are such a distinct in how you walk and how you move through the world. And like, I can sometimes even like anticipate and hear when you're standing at the top of the footsteps waiting to come down here in the minutes of you being
She even
down
has
there.
this line where she's like, I can sometimes feel like you've tapped my phone lines.
Exactly.
And I can almost feel you there.
Yeah. And he doesn't deny it. And that's probably because honestly, he probably has at some point. Like Harry is so completely captured by all of the security.
I would say like Harry's defining character trait is his paranoia.
Yeah.
Right? And like the movie does a really good job early on demonstrating that. Like again, even the landlord doing something really nice, and he's just like, how did you get in here? How do you know it's my birthday? Right?
And again, like I talked about in the last episode, how this movie is very comparable to a movie like The Killer that David Fincher put out a couple years ago, where we see it's so funny because Harry, like he has to unlock like 2 or 3 locks before he can get into his apartment. And then he also has the alarm system in his apartment, and his landlord is able to just like walk right through, like obviously, unlocked all the locks, must have turned the alarm off and then reset it before they left, and then left the gift for him there. Like obviously Harry is not as secure as he thinks he is.
Right. And I'm sure we'll get to that later on, but like
the end of the movie. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wasn't that enamored by Harry, like watching Harry work, but I was really interested in like those small moments when like he's rubbing up against other personalities, right?
Yeah.
Actually, I think my favorite sequence in this whole movie is, so he goes to this convention and there's this other guy there. I forget his name, but he's like,
yeah,
short, dark-haired, stocky, right? And he's a very like fast-talking New York kind of personality.
Yep.
And like that guy crushed it as like he's sort of like, Harry is sort of the number 1 surveillance guy, and this guy's kind of number 2. And it's so interesting, like watching their personalities like bounce off each other. Like, again, Harry's very quiet and like doesn't want to divulge anything, but then this guy, he's like very loud, very fast talking. Like he clearly has like a very high opinion of himself and his own work. And like he communicates like he's civil and friendly and kind of charming, but also like you can tell he has a huge bone to pick with Harry.
Yeah.
And like he really resents that Harry's better than him.
Yes.
And it's like watching those two like dance off each other. I think this movie really excels as like, you talk about like the various types of conflict. Like it really excels as like the kind of like subtle conflict between characters,
Yeah. Well, and I kind of agree with you that apart from the final 30 minutes or so of this movie, like especially when their party from the convention gets back to Harry's office, that scene is perfect in my eyes. Like from every standpoint. Like,
yeah, like the pacing,
yeah,
like all that stuff. We get into his backstory. There's this woman named, I think her name's
Meredith.
Meredith, who's there, who's like clearly got the hots for Harry.
Yeah.
And like she's kind of like throwing herself at him and like trying to get him to open up. And he doesn't really, but he does kind of have this moment where he's like, he kind of talks about Amy and how he might have loved her even though he couldn't open up to her. And then there is this devastating moment though where he goes back into like the kitchen or the living room or whatever, and it turns out that number 2 has recorded his
The whole conversation, the whole heart-to-heart.
Yeah, so he finally opened up to Meredith, and then this slimy little asshole recorded it.
Yeah.
That was one of those moments where I'm like, oh. Like,
well, and even bringing that up, that's another point where I wrote down, Harry missed the fact that pen was obviously a recording
trap,
device.
yeah.
As soon as he put that pen in Harry's suit, I was like, that's a recording device.
Oh, shit. See, that went over my head, too. He almost kind of reminds me of, like, Rorschach from, like, Watchmen, where it's like a relatively competent detective, but like he clearly has some huge blind spots, right?
Exactly. Well, and even Harry's faith and that he's Catholic, and at one point he goes and does confession. That is, I think,
I have had impure thoughts about women.
Yeah, you have to look at like the higher level of that. Again, this is another point where I was thinking about this movie and I was like, oh, this is so, I can't believe that we're getting into this right now, and like we're kind of questioning the Catholic faith in this movie, because the confession is another form of surveillance, essentially.
I think what I found so captivating about Harry is that, like, he almost kind of reminded me of Batman, just in the sense that, like, a hyper-competent, consummate professional who seems to have a real difficulty, like, emotionally connecting with people.
Right.
Like, Harry clearly wants some manner of companionship, but he's also like extremely scared of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, he clearly has some kind of affection for Amy, but again, is too scared to open up to her.
Right.
There's a scene where Stan leaves him to go join another surveillance expert, and like Harry is kind of like, "Well, what are you doing?" And he's like, "You better not be telling my secrets."
Yeah.
But like, it's kind of a reflexive reaction, and you can tell that like he's genuinely kind of hurt.
Yeah.
That Stan would leave. So like, what I found so compelling about Harry is, again, like, clearly this guy wants intimacy and he wants connection. I mean, we all do for the most part, but like, he's just so incapable of letting his guard down.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. But again, then you see him confess during confession, and like it's essentially a Catholic guilt story, right?
I guess, but like, even to me though, the confession scene, it's like, this is another instance of him wanting connection but not being able to get it, right?
Right.
Because like, he's not, you know, it's a confession booth. Like, you're not even looking anyone in the eye.
Yeah. Whereas it's so funny because you and I interpret that scene wildly different, because I don't really think about that. Like, obviously I think of that as more like the surface level. I think like the reason why Francis Ford Coppola would include a scene like that is him turning the camera on religion and being like, you know, like, this is like one of the oldest forms of surveillance is the confession, and like the kind of, you know, there's a figure who is, you know, able to know the inner workings of a community and track that and follow.
You know
that.
who the ultimate surveillance expert is? God.
Yeah. So that was another one of those scenes where I was like, I'm actually a little bit surprised that was included in there, because I think that it's very critical of the Catholic faith and of religion in general. Like, you know, you could even compare it to Scientology, where like Scientology has its own form of confession, and it's just as sinister as any other form of confession could be at its absolute most sinister form.
Yeah, you could be right. That kind of, I was looking at it more as like, as the character of Harry and like his unwillingness to open up to people.
This is the other part of the question of, do I like Harry? The question of like, is Harry lonely? Is Harry a loner? Or is Harry happy in his loneliness? And it was something that like I kept kind of questioning as I watched this movie. And I guess where I land at the end is probably that Harry is somewhat lonely, but I don't think he's able to actually have a connection with anybody else.
I kind of strongly disagree. I think there is something kind of, this is where the pity comes in, right?
Right.
The final shot of the movie, him sitting there playing his saxophone, having torn his whole apartment apart.
Yeah.
I'm just like, wow, this guy is just, he is alone.
Yeah.
He is fundamentally alone.
Yeah, he's a loner, for sure.
Yeah. I don't think he's thrilled about it, though, you know?
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of where I landed as well. Like, I don't think that he's happy in his loneliness. Like, there are plenty of people who don't ever have a significant other, and they're completely
or
fine
even
with
like
that.
many friends, and they're okay with that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that all of these ideas and thoughts about Harry and his character just prevent him from being able to get any closer to anyone?
On the one hand, I do see Harry as this guy who's just terribly afraid of intimacy and who can't really open up. I also think, like, you know, because he's a surveillance expert and because of his various neuroses, it's kind of like maybe he's right to be suspicious of other people, though, right?
He also is just, like, not a good judge of character. Like,
no.
And this is clear to, like, the overarching part of the story with the people that he's surveilling versus the director versus, you know, Meredith. Like, he essentially continuously throws his support behind people who are mean ill intent toward him.
Right. Well, it's interesting too. Like, he doesn't even really know who he's working for or like why.
Right.
You know, there's the scene where Stan is kind of asking questions about what they're talking about, and he's kind of just like, "Yeah, like I don't know. All our client needs is like a fat, juicy recording."
Yeah. I guess to kind of start to wrap up this conversation about whether I like Harry Caul or not, I like Harry Caul as a character. I think Harry Caul, this is one of my favorite character studies of all time.
I agree. Like, I certainly wouldn't want to hang out with this guy.
No.
But, like, yeah.
Like, I don't know, we just spent the last 25 minutes or so talking about Harry Caul. And I could probably continue to talk about him, and we probably will continue to talk about him because he's a central part of this movie. But I think that as a character, one of the great characters of cinema.
He's up there. It's certainly one of the great performances.
Yeah. But do I actually like Harry? Like, yeah, no, I wouldn't hang out with him. Like, he wouldn't hang out with me.
No, I know. And, like, even if you did hang out with him, he wouldn't say anything, right?
Yeah.
There is something kind of ineffectual about him, too, right? Like, again, This isn't, like, a glorious character. There's this scene where he goes into this, like, office building to meet with the director, but, like, these two guys try to stop him, and they're just like, all right, like, come on, get out of here, Harry. And he kind of just, like, very obviously starts to turn around, but then very obviously, like, tries to rush past these two guys, and they just very easily, like, unman him and just drag him out of the office, right? It's like Walter White dragging the plant to the window. You're just like, what are you even doing, right?
Yeah.
And then when he does overhear the murder, it's not like he tries to intervene.
No.
He doesn't really do anything. Like, again, for as hyper competent as Harry is in this one specific area, in every other area, he seems kind of pathetic.
Yeah.
Maybe that's kind of what I walked away with. For as extremely talented as he is in this one area, there is something just kind of pathetic about the guy.
I compared this to The Killer already, but it's something like The Killer, and I think a lot of other movies kind of ask this question as well, is like, are highly competent people just actually able to navigate the rest of the world and, like, their lives? Like, and a lot of the times it's usually no.
Well, this is something I've thought about a lot, is that, like, you know, I almost feel like every human being is born with only so many skill points. And it's like, if you want to be super, super good at one thing, you sink all your skill points into that. But then when you're not doing that one thing, you kind of just flounder around, you know?
Right.
It's funny, like, one of my favorite characters of all time is Goku from Dragon Ball Z. That's right, I worked Dragon Ball Z into this podcast. And it's like how Goku is, like, one of the most resourceful fighters in the universe, but, like, he's too stupid to drive a car, you know?
I kind of want to talk about a few of the scenes of this movie and, like, the trajectory of it, because that opening scene with the surveillance and, like, this conversation, like, I wasn't really drawn in by it at all. Like, I was kind of a little bit confused, and, like, and I kind of thought, okay, well, that was a conversation, sure, and, like, it showed off, like,
that certainly was a conversation.
That certainly was a conversation, and, like, yeah, okay, that showed off, like, the professionalism of this group of guys who are able to effectively, like, track these two up until a point until when they kind of realize that maybe they're being followed. And I was like, okay, well, that was kind of neat, but, you know, that didn't really draw me in all that much, or you know, I didn't see where this was going. And then there's kind of the slow burn of, like, okay, well, let's get into Harry's character, and, like, let's see what Harry's all about and everything. And, like, all the while there's something about that conversation, or those two people, these two young people, like, obviously they're much younger than him.
Yeah.
And he seems to maybe be empathetic towards the woman.
I think he gets there.
Yeah, and so he's more interested in this conversation than I am, and he keeps like, fiddling with the audio and trying to like see really what their full conversation was, because the last thing that they kind of show of this conversation before that scene ends is those two talking to each other in silence while there's a drum going on, so we can't pick up on what they're saying at all. And that seems to be maybe the crucial part of the conversation that we've missed. Eventually, he gets it, and what they're saying is he'd kill us if he got the chance.
Right.
Even at that point, I was like, okay, like, that's interesting, but whatever. Like, that, like, obviously, so whoever wants this information, like, I don't understand what this conversation is about yet. And
like there's something a little uncanny about the conversation where, like, there's a moment where they walk up to a homeless person and they talk about how like the newspaper shutdown caused a bunch of homeless people to like freeze to death, and like the woman starts talking about how, oh, you used to have a mom who cared about him and blah blah blah, and there's something kind of stilted about it where, to me as a viewer, I was like, again, are they speaking in code?
Yeah. And especially, too, because we don't hear every single sentence that's said between the two of them as they're walking around. Like, it does feel like we're even missing bits of the conversation that is kind of mundane, right?
So it does. Harry gets kind of obsessive about it. I mean, he's an obsessive guy, but like, it gets to the point where like there's got to be something here, right?
Right.
Like, yeah. And then he starts kind of having this crisis of conscience where he doesn't really want to turn over the audio because he's scared of what they're going to do to these young
the implication.
People. Because of the implication. Yeah. So, like, like there's a point when, like, he's kind of fiddling with it in his workshop when Meredith is there. And he's like, doesn't she sound scared? Like, doesn't she sound scared right here?
But even before that, like, the scene that I wanted to talk about, because it was the first scene that really made me sit up in my seat and go, okay, there's something more here, is when he goes to drop off the audio to the director, and the director's allegedly not there.
Right.
And instead, it's Harrison Ford playing his assistant, essentially, and his assistant's like, well, just leave it with me. I have the money here. Don't worry about it, kind of thing. Like, I will get it into the right hands. And Harry is very hesitant to allow that and ends up ripping the audio out of Harrison Ford's character's hands and walking out of the building with it.
Yeah.
And
there's that funny moment too where in frustration he kind of like chucks the audio file at the lawn.
Yeah.
And then he just kind of like very impotently just doubles back and picks it up.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that scene is really great because Harrison Ford's fantastic, and like he's always fantastic, but that's like, it's such an early performance from him, and you can kind of even see in that moment that this character, like this person, is going to be a bigger character, a bigger
someday
star.
He's going to turn into Red Hulk and throw a car.
Yeah. And Harry leaves, and as he's leaving, and it's so crazy too, because like Harrison Ford is like, you can see him in the background standing there watching this character try to leave the building. And in that moment, you see the man that they've been surveilling is on the floor, just like walking around like nothing's happening. And you're like, that's strange, right?
That kind of went over my head. I didn't notice the guy there.
You didn't notice?
No.
Did you notice the woman then? She was in the elevator?
I didn't notice that either.
How did you? Oh my God, man.
Wow.
That was the moment where I literally sat up and I was like, oh my God, like that is so, like, I don't know where this is going now.
It doesn't help that they're not very distinguished looking people.
No, but like,
I was like, huh.
Oh man. See, this is the problem. This is why you didn't appreciate this movie as much as I did. You didn't catch anything.
I was just like, what the hell's going on? Yeah.
Like Harry notices the male character is in the hallway while Harrison Ford is watching them. And then as he gets into the elevator, she walks into the elevator on a lower floor. And then so he is like, completely like in shock.
What the fuck is going on?
Yeah. And that's where, again, like I said, like I sat up in my seat and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't expect that. And like, why are these characters here? And so suddenly, like, you start to actually care about this conversation and think about, okay, like, what are they saying? Like, is it in code? Like, who's he? Like, who would kill them?
Who's going to kill them? Yeah.
And so like, that's that one of the critical points of the whole movie. Really floored me and really got me hooked. I said as soon as that happened, like, okay, I'm in. And that actually even happens before the surveillance convention, which again, the surveillance convention, I thought that it was really interesting that he would go to a surveillance convention wherein, he's such a private person, but he cares so deeply about the surveillance and the technology behind it.
That
he's compelled to go there. Like, I think it's so funny because I think that Harry as a character is compelled. He's often like compelled like to go do something. Like,
again, he seems like a very obsessive person.
Yes.
This is where the Batman analogy comes back in.
And so even in that scene, like, Harrison Ford's character Martin shows up at the convention, which is interesting because like, why else would he be there?
And he's just kind of sitting there drinking a beer too.
Yeah,
like,
but why else would he be there other than to see where Harry has gone, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And so they kind of have a back and forth at one point too, when Harry ends up in the same kind of side room as Martin is. But even before that, I thought it was really interesting that, like we talked about, there's kind of a quaintness to some of the technology that they're using back in the 70s. But there's the point in time when he's using that like camera and he's panning around the room, and then the camera kind of ends off with a shot of Harry, and he's in like on the screen, the monitor, watching himself. And I was in that moment, I was like, oh, Harry's the one being surveilled right now.
Yeah. Dun dun dun.
So like all of this, like, if you're paying a lot of attention to all of this, like, I don't know, I was really into everything going on. Like, I was so hyper focused on everything as well because I was so fascinated by it all.
When he meets up with Harrison Ford at the convention, doesn't he just kind of say, like, come drop off the audiophile, like the director is going to be there?
Yeah.
Like,
he eventually is like, okay, like, I concede, like, you can come and we'll give you the money, give us the audio. I will set up a conversation with the director that you can meet him, kind of thing.
And again, at this point in the movie, you're kind of like, who's the director?
Yeah.
You kind of get the sense, like, it's probably some kind of like government agency, but again, it's just the director, right? Like, okay, can we jump ahead to the reveal? Because like that was a moment when I actually kind of sat up.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's really agonizing over this audio file, and like at one point he even says to Meredith, like, I think I'm just going to destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that like he falls asleep and he has this like crazy nightmare where he sees this young woman there. And again, he's scared that if he hands over this audio file, she's going to get murdered. And like he's talking to her in his dream, and out of nowhere, he just starts confessing all this shit to her, right?
Right.
Again, in his dream where he's like, oh, I lost the use of my like left leg and right arm when I was a kid, and one time my mom put me in the bathtub and then the doorbell rang and I almost drowned. And then like there's another time when like my dad brought some guy over and I don't know why I did it, but I kicked him in the like really hard in the chest and he died 2 weeks later. Like, and you're just kind of like, all right, Harry, Jesus, like say less. We keep seeing this audio file, and again, you keep thinking like they're speaking in code, right? Something's going on. So then we finally go to meet this director in this office, and I thought this was very masterful because it's all told from like visuals, but like we go and meet the director, and you see like photos on the wall of like the director and this young woman together, and for me, I was like, oh, like it's an affair.
Yes.
And there's something so like beautifully anticlimactic about it. Where you're just like, oh, it's just a stupid affair. Like, and then we meet the director. Hi, Robert Duvall.
Yes.
And you're just like, oh, so that's it? Like, it's not some grand conspiracy. Your hot young wife is just running around on you.
Right.
And there is something so. I mean, it's funny, like, Harrison Ford is there, and even he seems a little embarrassed. Like, like, the director at one point is like, you want it to be true, don't you? And Harrison Ford's like, no, I just want you to have all the information.
Yeah.
And, like, you piece it together just from the photos on the wall. But again, it's just like, oh, that's it.
Yeah.
It's as mundane as an affair, right?
Right.
But you still retain that element of like tension and danger because you're like, what are they going to do to these young people?
At this point in time, we understand that the last part of the conversation is that he'd kill us if he got the chance. And then they even say, like, we've even learned at this point that there's a meeting set in a hotel room.
Right. And they kept coming back to that. I'm like, okay, this is going to be important, right?
Yeah.
So, like, as a writer myself, I really admired that turn where you spend the first, like, almost hour and a half being like, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean?
Right.
And then you get to the reveal and you're like, oh.
Yeah.
It's an affair.
Yeah.
God damn it.
But even in that sense, like, yeah, okay, it almost feels like underwhelming and
like deliberately underwhelming. Like underwhelming in a satisfying way.
Yep. And still, even then, Harry's compelled because he wants to know what's going to happen to this young couple, right? now that their affair is found out. So he's got the opportunity to go to the hotel, and this is again where I find Harry is a failure at what, like, as a person, because he goes to the front hotel and he says, I want such and such room, like the room that they've talked about in
like
the
772
audio.
or something.
Yeah, and the guy's like, you can't take that room. We have, like, somebody's already taken that room. And he's like, okay, well, I want the room beside that. And it's like, if there is going to be a murder here, you've now, like, incriminated yourself because you've told the front, like, person that you want that.
I want that one there.
Yeah, like you've made yourself like a prime suspect in this, like. And so again, like, I sat there and I was like, yeah, Harry's kind of an idiot. Like, he's kind of like, he's not a successful.
Well, and then again, like, we see him getting to work, like drilling a hole in the bathroom, and like,
and that, can I just say, from the time that he gets into that room until the end of the movie, perfection.
Yeah.
I thought every piece of that was amazing.
This movie has an incredibly strong third act.
Yes.
So, but again, what I think I find more pitiful about Harry is that he hears the murder happening and he doesn't do anything.
Right.
He just kind of slumps over in the TV, like, and agonizes over it.
Well, I mean, he panics, right? Like, he freaks out, and then he blasts the TV because he thinks, okay, well, you know, if the people beside me hear this loud TV, then they'll assume that I can't hear them. Is essentially, I think, his thought process there. And then he's just like, he's petrified with fear for hours.
I guess, like, to be fair to Harry, like, if you heard a murder going, would you intervene?
And
you think he'd at least call the front desk or something?
No, that's not who Harry is. Like,
yeah.
he's pathetic. Like,
yeah,
he's a pitiful character, and like, and I mean, kudos to Francis Ford Coppola for putting a genuine, like, jump scare in this movie in such an unexpected moment too. Like, when everything's so quiet and so tense, to just like throw the murder at you like that.
Bah! Yeah,
I did not see that coming. Like, I literally jumped back, like, just like Harry, and two, like, Harry, he's basically screaming without, like, making any noise, and like, he blasts the TV, and like, that whole sequence, I was like, holy shit, like, I can't believe that scene blew me away. It was so effective at what it was doing.
That was very, very good. And then there's one final twist.
Yeah.
That it turns out...
Whoa, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. I still
okay.
have more to talk about.
Okay.
So Harry then goes into the room, right, afterwards. And
oh, right. I forgot about this.
Yeah, like, you keep skipping ahead. There's so much good stuff I want to talk about in this movie. So Harry goes into the room to see, you know, to collect evidence or see what's happened, see who's been murdered, kind of thing, right? And the room is spotless. There's nothing in it.
Right.
And, you know, he's looking around, he's looking in the tub, and finally, just before he's about to leave, he flushes the toilet. And when he flushes the toilet actually is clogged. And when it kind of backs up into the hotel room, it's blood that has been pushed down
the
into
drain.
it.
Yeah, like bloody rags.
Yeah, and it essentially, like, all comes up and pours over the toilet. And A, very, very effective filmmaking.
Yeah, very gross.
B, I kind of wonder if that's actually a dream that Harry has had.
I did want to talk about this. Like, the movie is very grounded, but then towards the third act, it gets a little more dreamlike, like, in the sense where he has this extended dream sequence with this woman where, like, he's trying to talk to her through the fog. And
yeah, it's the woman from he recorded.
Yeah, like Anne or whatever her name is. And he just starts babbling all these truths to her, but like they're wandering through like a cemetery in the fog. And then like even the jump scare in the hotel room, even that I was like, is that him imagining the murder? Like,
right.
Yeah. You know what, for me though, I was just... When the blood started coming back up, part of me was like, I'm getting the fuck out of here. I'm not cleaning that shit up. Like, yeah.
I kind of lean towards that maybe as a dream sequence, because also, like, these people have obviously covered their tracks so well that, like, to leave a toilet in that state and then have all that blood pouring over would obviously, like, be a weird thing to do,
like in a weird oversight.
Yeah, especially too because we saw a dream sequence earlier. Like, anytime there's a dream sequence in a movie or TV, like, I automatically am more open to other dream sequences that may or may not like be explicit in that they're a dream sequence. Like,
Okay.
it's the same thing with The Substance. Like, I would say that the final 30 minutes of The Substance are probably a dream sequence.
Well, it's hard to say, right? That movie
It
had a
is.
very wild tone. But
Yeah, that made me think of that. But then the final reveal, like, I'll let you do the final reveal because you're really excited about it.
So the final reveal, it turns out that the young woman was not murdered. Instead, Robert Duvall was murdered. The
Yes.
director.
The director was murdered.
It turns out this hot young couple conspired against the director, her husband, and they killed him.
Yeah, and the connotation of he'd kill us if he got the chance was more like, well, he'd kill us if he got the chance.
Right, so let's kill him first.
Yeah.
Right? And then they kind of even managed to frame it as like an auto accident and shit like that, right?
Yes, which is also kind of like wild to think about, that they like effectively staged this murder as, you know, as an accident essentially, because, you know, there's plenty of conspiracies out there about famous people who have died in the past, and whether or not their death was a suicide or a murder,
or we just covered
an
it up.
accident.
Yeah,
or cover
right.
up. And like there's so many examples of that.
Well, I'm jumping ahead a little bit more. The very effective final scene is Harry playing the saxophone in his apartment, and Harrison Ford calls him and basically just says, like, we know that you know, stay out of our hair, we'll be watching, right?
Yeah.
And maybe this is me grasping the wrong straw. I'm like, was this really an affair, or was this like an elaborate ruse to like get rid of this director? Because, like, again, we don't really know.
Yeah.
We don't really know anything about this organization. It's presumably like the CIA or the FBI or some shit like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could even just be a regular business, honestly. We don't know anything.
Right. But then, I mean, just the fact that Harrison Ford is in on it, I'm just like,
Yes.
was the director like a shithead and they just, like, was this young couple really having an affair, or was this engineered?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. And, you know, there is a lot of ambiguity in that. And historically, like, I'm not usually a fan of ambiguity, but I think this movie throughout the film, like, it's very intentional in that you don't know all the details, and that, like, you know, we're hyper focused in on Harry and what Harry knows and what Harry is able to piece together. It's like very comparable to Chinatown, right?
Yeah, really. Forget it, Harry. I don't know what city this takes place in, but yeah.
I think it's in LA, but
forget it, Harry. It's LA.
It's Chinatown, LA.
Yeah.
You know, I thought that was really effective too, because I didn't expect that Harrison Ford's character was going to be in it either. When he calls him at the end, and Harrison Ford has such a distinct voice, right? Like, it's crazy that, man, he's in a movie like this, like, so early, and that it's fun going back and seeing Harrison Ford.
Yeah,
in such an
I know,
early role.
right? This is pre Han Solo,
Yeah.
right? So
It's so cool.
crazy.
But yeah, like, I didn't expect that, and then my suspicion is that there was an affair there, but obviously Harrison Ford's character is in on this. So, like, yeah, who knows what the director...
Well, and, like, potentially, like, he just blackmailed them, because, like,
Yeah.
he would have kind of been aware of what's going on,
Well,
right?
and obviously, like, that kind of brings up the earlier scene where Harrison Ford's character tries to forcefully take the audio files from Harry. And,
Right.
and he says, like, oh, the director's not here, but I'll get this for you, and here's the money. And that kind of maybe answers that question of, like, why is Harrison Ford character so pushy and, like, you know, demanding
Like, where
this?
is the director, right?
Yeah.
Is it, if he's in on this conspiracy, he's like, no, I'm just taking it.
Yeah.
Yoink. And again, it's just, you know, it's like this labyrinth where you're just like, I don't fucking know. Like, anything could be going on, right?
Right.
And then that leads to the very effective final sequence where Harry just, in a fit, just completely demolishes his own apartment searching for bugs.
Right. Again, this is an amazing end to this movie, right?
And when I say demolishing, I mean, like, he's ripping the floorboards out of the ground.
It's, like, kind of sick to watch. Like, I felt kind of gross watching him do it, because, like, it gives it, like, I don't know, the movie, it feels like we have like 5-10 minutes of this, and it probably isn't even half that long, but, like,
well, it's funny how I did check the runtime after, you know, the big reveal, and it's like, oh, we've got like 15 minutes left. Like, what's gonna happen? And then, like, we watch him do this in, like, meticulous detail, right?
yeah, it genuinely, like, made me feel gross watching this man completely unravel in his apartment.
I believe, by the way, I believe, like, spoiler alert for Better Call Saul, I believe that the season 3 finale was a homage to this.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised by that.
Yeah,
I don't actually remember Better Call Saul well enough to even remember that season, but
Okay, I don't want to get too much into it because it will spoil season 3. And
I do remember.
Right?
Yes. It relates to his brother, right?
Right. Yeah. I don't want to get. By the way, Better Call Saul is the greatest TV show of all time, so go watch it.
Nice. I thought that ending to this movie was fantastic in like the most disgusting way possible. Like, and
the final shot too of him it's like a high angle shot, and he's just sitting in the wreckage of his own apartment, just sadly playing the saxophone to himself.
Yeah. I guess Jess pointed out at the end, she was like, oh, well, probably the saxophone is the thing that's recording him. Did that ever cross your mind?
It did, but it also crossed my mind that maybe there is no bug.
Yeah,
like,
that's the other thing I thought too.
Maybe it's just paranoia. Like, maybe if he thinks he's being surveilled, he'll...
There was even a question I saw online of like, was the call even real? Like, or is it like his paranoia just like completely getting to him?
I mean, I don't know that he ever seems like unhinged or delusional or anything like that.
Right.
But yeah, that is possible too.
Mm-hmm. I thought this movie was amazing, and the ending really solidified it for me because there's something also just like so upsetting just seeing Harry completely disassociate at the end, and like just the movie concludes with him in like his completely ripped up, shredded apartment.
Well, especially Harry is such a rigid, like tightly controlled person who seems very particular about his things. Like watching him just literally rip the floorboards out of the ground. Like there's also that really great shot where, again, we know Harry's Catholic, and as soon as he gets off the phone with Harrison Ford, he walks over to this little statue of the Virgin Mary, and he kind of picks it up, and you're like, oh, he's like looking to God for comfort. And then he smashes it open.
Well, and it's the last thing in his apartment that he smashes too.
Oh, yeah. So I'm actually fonder of the theory that there just is no bug.
Yeah.
And they're just like, fuck you.
Yeah.
You're under surveillance.
It's very possible. Going back like 10, 15 minutes in the movie, like, again, it's showing Harry's guilt, his Catholic guilt, kind of like overpowering him, but also just like not good at interacting in this world. Like, he goes effectively back to the agency, the office that the director's at, and like I think that's the scene actually where he tries to go up and see the director, and the two guys are like, no, you can't go see the director, because that's presumably when the cover-up is happening,
right, where the coup is going on.
Yeah. And then so he goes back, and then as he gets kicked out, he sees what's her nuts in the
what's her nuts
in the I'm looking at a thing of mixed nuts behind you, but
you've had mixed nuts all this time, you've never shared them with me.
So he sees her in like that limo outside of the building, right? And that's his like, you know, another sign of like what's going on here,
like,
kind of thing.
What the fuck?
Yeah, and then he goes back again, and he's like in the scene, like after it's announced that the director has died in a car accident, and he goes back, and he's just present and like so obviously there, like he's not even hiding in the crowd at all, like he's just kind of like standing there when the director's wife comes out and is like talking to the media about the director's death and everything.
I guess there is something to be said about Harry in that maybe he is kind of like a tech bro in the sense that like he's very, very good at this one specific skill set, but when it comes to like subtlety and detective work, he kind of shits the bed a little.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny. You'd be like, Harry, come on, man. Like, you don't walk up to the gates. You don't walk right up to the black gates, you know?
Like, yeah, exactly.
That would be funny, like, in a fantasy novel where, like, the hero just walks right up to the Dark Lord's fortress and, like, demands to know what's going on.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I do want to talk about the scene where he takes all of his friends back to his workshop.
Okay, this is my this is a complaint.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's a little out of character that he would have company over.
It is, and I kind of thought about that a little bit too, and it's like, is he at this point so desperate for connection that he's willing to let these characters come back and all hang out there?
Like invade his space?
Yeah.
But yeah, potentially.
Yeah, no, that crossed my mind as well, and like, you know, I thought that scene was one of the most compelling scenes of the whole movie because he's very like... This is very, like, against code.
He's very uncomfortable throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, he's very uncomfortable. You already mentioned, like, you know, the kind of subtle battle going on between him and number
Bernie,
2.
Yeah. Bernie, yeah. And then at one point, Bernie's like, hey, what do you say we pool our resources together and blah, blah, blah. Harry pretty clearly cannot stand this fucking guy. Yeah.
Well, and his patience wears very thin, and that's genuinely like something that we see throughout the movie, is that he has very little patience for anyone.
I think the moment when the guy reveals that he recorded his heart-to-heart with Meredith, that's the moment where I was genuinely like, oh,
right,
fuck this guy.
Yeah. But I don't know, part of why I love that scene as well is, again, the audio mixing of that scene, and like, the characters, and I gotta imagine with a full surround sound, like, you would really hear like each of the characters off in their own part of the room. And you even feel it like when you're listening or watching that scene, like there's moments where the audio is a little bit more muffled of the characters, or like it feels like, you're hearing their movements kind of thing. And that's maybe again foreshadowing that Bernie's listening in with the pen. And there's just like, there's kind of like a quietness that happens, and like, it's just, as somebody who edits this podcast, like you said, I very much appreciated all of that, and just the audio element of that part of the movie.
Yeah, no. And again, like the moments I found the most compelling about this movie were the moments when Harry is like trying desperately to connect with other people, or more to the point, like desperately resisting the attempts to connect with people.
Right.
Like actually that like 15-minute sequence at the party is probably the highlight of the movie for me. And then, by the way, I don't know if we've mentioned this yet, but like, no, but how tragic is it that like, Meredith, seems to like really care about him and really like him. Again, it's another one of those moments where it's just like, what is this younger woman seeing this old guy? But then, and he does kind of open up to her, and she stays behind and like drags him into bed, and you're kind of like, oh, what a nice lady. And then he wakes up in the morning and she took the fucking tape.
Yep. And she's giving it away to Martin and the director.
You're like, so it's funny. Like, as heartbreaking as it is that Harry can't seem to connect with other people, there's part of it's just kind of like, well, no, like maybe you shouldn't. Like, sometimes his paranoia is correct.
For sure. And again, like I said earlier, he's a bad judge of character. Like, he's always siding with the wrong person.
Well, it's funny. I saw this old interview with Malcolm Gladwell where he said paranoia is bad because like 95% of people are trustworthy. But then what do you do when you're stuck in Harry's world?
Right.
Where 95% of people aren't trustworthy.
Yeah. No, and I'm sure like being in that world, like you're inherently with people who aren't trustworthy, like you said, like on a regular basis, right? Like even the very nature of it, like you're listening in on people's mistrust. You're hired because of people's mistrust.
Right. So like paranoia is almost kind of like it would serve you in that profession, but it would destroy your personal life.
Yeah. I also love, as that scene's kind of coming to a close, the night sequence when the audio is playing and Terry's lying on the bench, and there's kind of like the mirror of, that's the point in the audio when the woman's talking about the poor homeless man on the bench. Like, she's like, oh, that poor boy on the bench.
Like someone used to care about him.
Yeah. And it's really focusing in on Harry at that moment. And I thought that was really effective. Like, that was thought of when they were doing that scene, that was going to eventually come back around in that sense.
They do a good job, like, going back to that conversation over and over and over again, and like opening up new dimensions of it.
Exactly. So I think that's everything I wanted to talk about in the deep dive, like in front of the camera part.
I think that about covers it on my end too.
We have been talking for quite a while, actually, and I was kind of expecting that. Like, I had a lot of thoughts about this movie.
I had thoughts too. Yeah. I would say, I found Harry in those character moments particularly compelling, but like, there is some really great plot turns. Like, again, I actually think the reveal that, like, when he walked in the office and it turned out it was just an affair, I'm like, okay, like, I understand why Francis Ford Coppola is considered a genius. Like, that is a perfect turn, right?
Right. No, I agree. Like, it truly is like one of those all-time screenplays, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sequels, prequels, and reboots. So the main inspiration for this movie is Michelangelo Antonioni's movie Blow Up, that's why I was giggling earlier before we started recording, was
Okay.
Antonionios.
Antonionios.
That's his name.
Are you sure you're saying that correctly?
Antonionios.
All right.
I the last time there was too many O-nos at the end.
Oh, no.
But yeah, so Michelangelo Antonioni.
Okay.
Say it with me, Antonioni.
Antonioni.
So the movie Blow Up from 1966, a key influence of this. So it's a movie that's also somewhat about surveillance, but I believe, I can't remember how they surveilled in that movie. It was different. It was different in that sense, although there's a lot of comparisons between the two movies. Like, it's very heavily inspired by it.
Okay.
There's also a movie by Tony Scott, who we've covered last year when we did True Romance. Or even 2 years ago now. The 1998 film Enemy Estate is considered a unofficial sequel to this movie, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I can kind of see that.
Yeah. Have you seen that movie?
No, but I've heard of it.
Okay, yeah. So Gene Hackman's the protagonist of this one, and he's basically playing the exact same character. And so there's kind of that connection there, which is kind of cool that maybe there's an unofficial sequel. Like, they've done that other times. Like, The Rock is kind of the unofficial sequel to Sean Connery's 007 James Bond movies. So
okay,
there's kind of occasions where you get unofficial movies or sequels.
We're like, let's just do that again, but call it something different for legal reasons.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think that's cool, and I kind of want to watch that movie now. I don't think it's quite as good or as revered as this one is, but
hey, they tried.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So effects and filming, Gene Hackman struggled to get into character with this one because the character of Harry Caul is just like the complete opposite of who Gene Hackman is as a person.
Okay.
So Gene Hackman, like, Coppola said that he was very fond of him because he was very outgoing and approachable. He liked dressing very casually around set, but Harry Caul's like very socially awkward. He's a loner, like
very well dressed.
Very well dressed, but also all of his clothing, and like you and I wouldn't catch on to this, but apparently all of his clothing was very out of date in the 70s.
Oh, was it?
Yeah,
right.
And like very out of place compared to everybody else that he was.
Well, it's
with.
funny because I was looking at everybody else in the movie, like, God, look at that fucking 70s fashion.
And like even like they made a point that his glasses are out of style for the 70s, so that was something that maybe we miss 50 years on, right?
It's something that's lost in the wash, but
yeah.
Hey, there you go.
The quote of Gene Hackman talking about the character is, "He was a really constipated character. It was a difficult role to play because it was so low-key."
Constipated is a good word. You know what? Apparently, what's his name? Gene Hackman is a writer on the side, and I believe it now.
Really?
Yeah, I think he retired from acting to write full-time.
Oh, no way. That's cool. Well, he could also have retired to play saxophone because he did learn to actually play the saxophone for this movie.
Okay, good for him.
The one thing that this movie does get criticism for, which I found interesting, was so as he's interpreting like the audio and like hearing different things and like different intonations to intonations to the voices. That is actually like different recordings of them reading those lines differently.
Okay.
So especially like, and I caught it on the very last quote of the movie where they were like, well, he would kill us if he had the chance. I heard the difference there myself.
That is an interesting choice to do that, though. Like, that must have been intentional.
It was in the sense that, I think that he had to. I think that he had to in order to kind of like mess with us as the audience a little bit.
Right, yeah.
But I can't remember. There was another director who was like very negative about that, who was like, "Oh, you cheated?
You cheated.
Yeah.
Come on."
So I don't know. I can kind of see where that director is coming from, and that like, yeah, like using different audios and throwing us off like that is kind of, it's a little bit of a dirty trick, but I think it's effective.
All creativity is a bit of a dirty trick.
That's true.
Yeah.
This movie, and we'll talk about its relationship to Chinatown a little bit later as well when we get into the Oscar part of the conversation. But they actually filmed the scene, like the scenes where it's in his office, are actually on the set of Chinatown.
Huh. Okay, then.
Yeah, they're filmed on the same set location. And then this one's really famous, so I thought I'd mention it here. But the last shot of the movie, when the camera's panning from right to left and then it pulls back at the last second, it's kind of mirroring what a surveillance camera surveillance camera acts.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So, score of the movie, scored by David Shire. It's original music. And I think the reason why I think that this movie, part of the reason why this movie is so successful, and especially in its tension building, is that they composed the score prior to actually filming. And then they actually played the score for the actors between scenes.
That's an interesting way to like get them into the mood of the piece. Yeah,
I think that's really like a really good idea for capturing the tone, especially if you, as a director, if you are very like hyper aware of what you want the tone of the movie to be, like to have that score beforehand. And I can think of one other movie that we've talked about on this podcast before that also did that, was E.T.
Right.
And E.T. specifically, like they had it composed before, especially before editing as well. So what they did was they edited shots to fit the score of the film.
That's something they used to do in like the old school Italian days too. It's an interesting it's interesting how music can really shape the whole experience.
I thought that it was really effective at doing that because it was something that I picked up on, and like I was paying attention, especially because again, this movie is about surveillance and audio, and it's very clear to me that that was something that Francis Ford Coppola cared a lot about in the making of this movie, because I genuinely can't think of many movies that have this good of audio mixing.
Yeah, really.
And especially, again, the highlight being during the workshop scene.
Mm-hmm.
And we've already talked about how it's related to Watergate, so I guess we don't have to talk about that and look back at the times.
I did think it was interesting, and again, I thought that this is intentional, but when he's in the hotel room and he turns on the TV, they mention Nixon.
They do,
and I was
funny enough.
And I thought that was a nod to Watergate, but it turns out that's kind of coincidental.
Kind of coincidental, but also actually kind of a nod to it, because it was the scandal was actually starting to come out in the news at the time that this movie was being edited and released. So that actually was something that was starting to become like a big scandal. But it wasn't until just after the release of this movie that Watergate became Watergate.
See, honestly, I need to like read a book or something about Watergate, because I don't really know much about it.
I feel like I don't either. Like I kind of understand the gist of it, that
like Nixon was caught wiretapping or some shit,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, like basically like his political opponents, essentially.
Right. Well, Jesus Christ, now in 2025, it's like it's called wiretapping. Oh, that's it? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Hey, that's small potatoes now, buddy.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know, that it's really interesting that movie comes out, and like that happens occasionally. Like there are movies, you know, that came out around 9/11 or were supposed to come out during 9/11, and then they had to be delayed or released later because of, you know, obviously what happened on 9/11.
Right.
But anyway, I think the other thing that I wanted to mention here too is that so there's kind of the reference of what happened in that prior situation with Harry Cullen, like, you know, his masterpiece work, like his seminal work out in New York, that one thing that he did that was so memorable to all of the rest of the surveillance community. So I guess the reference to that is they mentioned the Attorney General, and so apparently that is a reference, or could be considered a reference, to Robert F. Kennedy investigating Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union.
Okay.
So I thought that was kind of interesting. That's again one of those things that like it happened so long ago that I feel like you and I know, like, you know, the footnotes of that.
Wasn't Jimmy Hoffa assassinated or something?
They never found his body, so like,
right,
probably like almost certainly he was assassinated, but like we'll never know who did it or why or how or any of those questions, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's again one of those like interesting connections, and obviously speaks to some of the themes and ideas of the movie, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Roger Ebert gave this movie 4 to 4 stars and said Hackman as Call was one of the most affecting and tragic characters in all of the movies. And then he actually in 2001 added it to his great movies list and said that it's a career peak performance for Gene Hackman.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, and he even says that the writing of the film comes from another time and place than today's thrillers, which are often so simple-minded. And I kind of agree with him. Like, this is, again, one of the best screenplays I've ever seen portrayed on film.
It's certainly very well written, yeah.
Yeah. And so the legacy of this movie, it was nominated for 3 Oscars. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Sound. It didn't win any of those categories.
Ouch.
So Best Picture went to The Godfather Part 2, which we're going to start covering next week.
Okay.
And I kind of understand. Like, obviously, like The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 are two of the most iconic films of all time.
Imagine, like, still, like, you lost to yourself.
Yeah.
And you still won.
Yeah. And, like, I love this movie, but, I got to give it to The Godfather Part 2. We haven't even done the movie yet. I haven't watched The Godfather Part 2 in 2 years.
I haven't seen it ever.
Yeah.
So
we'll talk about that next week, which I'm really excited about. It lost to screenplay to Chinatown, actually.
That's a tough one, yeah.
Yeah, tough beat on that one. I think all three of them are actually somewhat tough beats because if I had to give this movie an award, it would have been Best Sound, hands down.
I mean, it would certainly be the most appropriate, right?
Yeah, and it actually lost to a movie called Earthquake, which even had a mixed reception when it came out, and I think it's just completely lost to time at this point.
Earthquake, huh?
Yeah, it's a Charlton Heston movie, which actually, funny enough, was co-wrote by Mario Puzo, who will be coming back to again next week.
The 70s were a busy time for all those guys.
Yeah,
shit.
No, for sure. And so I believe it takes place like in LA during an earthquake, like obviously, one of those standard like earthquake in LA movies. But they actually invented like a new type of audio equipment for the movie. It was called Sensurround. And so essentially what it was like this enhanced audio equipment that they had in movie theaters for that particular movie, where it made it feel like you were actually experiencing an earthquake in real time in the theater.
Okay, I mean, kind of a cheap novelty, but like, you would, yeah. I mean, that would probably win the Oscar that year.
Yeah, right? Like, it's so inventive that, like, it's hard not to give that one the Oscar. So it's kind of unfortunate it lost that one. I did some research on it because I was kind of interested in what Sensurround was. And so what it was like, it was kind of expensive audio equipment. And what it did was, like, it used bass to, like, make you feel it. Like, when you, like... If you've ever been in a car with somebody who has some sort of amp in their car and they throw the bass on it and you literally like
when the bass drops, yeah.
It's exactly like that. I think the same sort of feeling that they were using in theaters, but the problem was like it was really expensive to set up and like theaters just kind of quickly did away with it because it wasn't worth the
So it was
money.
like 3D for a hot minute.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly, for like a very short, very, very short moment in time.
Huh.
So it's kind of unfortunate because this movie, while it's a little bit lost to time, it's nowhere near the same as like Earthquake, which I heard, like from what I read online, was very mixed reception, like completely derivative, like not really all that interesting.
So it's like just a really shitty premise that they just propped up with like expensive audio equipment.
Yeah, exactly. Like
sometimes a cheap novelty is all you need.
Yep. So, I mean, like you look at Avatar, like Avatar is basically sold on its visuals.
Never heard of it.
So
when's Avatar 3 coming out?
This December?
Oh, I guess we're going to go see it again.
We probably will.
And then not remember it afterwards.
I remember like some things of Avatar 2.
I remember kind of liking both movies. It's just they're experiences that really don't stay with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. So anyway, and like you said, Gene Hackman and Francis Ford Coppola both very, very fond of this movie and consider it one of their best films of all time.
Yeah, as they should.
Yeah.
It's not as good as Megaopolis, though. Am I right?
Jesus. So, personal reviews and the partner factor. I guess I've been hyping this movie up quite a bit, so I'll just start and say that I thought this movie was amazing. Like, I genuinely, by the time that this movie wrapped up, I was like, that was one of the best movies ever made. Everything about it, like, yeah, it's a slow burn. Like, yeah, the first act, I was like, I don't know where this is going yet. I don't know if I like it. But it pulled me in. Like, the character study of Harry Caul is fascinating. Like, all of the bigger ideas here really popped for me. And at the end of the day, the audio, like I said, like, this is a movie that someday when I have my beautiful, beautiful
You should find some of that old audio equipment you were just telling me about and like set it up in your rec room.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, someday I'll have a nice basement theater system, but this is not the house for that.
I guess not.
So someday I'll have that sick setup.
Subscribe to our Patreon, and
we'll get there that much sooner.
Woo!
But yeah, this will be one of those first movies that I watch in that because I think that it genuinely is a masterpiece of audio mixing.
Okay, cool. I liked this movie, but I clearly was not as hot for it as you were.
Yeah.
I feel like I've said this about some of the old classics we've watched, where it's like I admire it more than I enjoy it.
Yeah.
I will say, like, it does, after you get past the first 45 minutes, it does significantly pick up.
Yeah.
So I would definitely recommend this movie to, like, hardcore cinephiles.
Mm-hmm.
But it just might have been a bit too slow of a burn for old Michael.
Yeah.
But that comes with the caveat that, like, I'm a very impatient viewer a lot of the time, where I'm just like, come on, where's this going? Like,
that's fair. And I think that just general audiences aren't going to mesh with a movie like this very well. And like, they're really going to feel that first 45 minutes or so.
yeah. And you know what the other thing too is that, like, that opening sequence where, like, they're filming the conversation is that, one, you don't really know what's going on, and two, like, it's not immediately visually compelling either.
Yeah.
And I'm not knocking the movie. I'm just saying, like, people recording a conversation is not as, like, compelling as, like, let's say an action sequence or something. Yeah. But, like, if you're willing to put the time in, you will enjoy it.
Yeah.
And then, again, 150 minutes in, Harrison Ford turns into the Red Hulk and, like, throws Harry out the window. So, like, that was worth watching.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah, I think that's it then. Jess didn't really pay attention in this movie. I think the first 45 minutes just completely lost her, and she just kind of disassociated. Actually, that was the one thing that I didn't really talk about as much as I wanted to, that I kind of thought about a little bit about this movie. Before we wrap up, let's just let me entertain myself for a few more minutes here before we wrap up this movie. Let's do it. I kind of thought that the end of the movie, where I felt like Harry was essentially disassociating with everything.
It almost felt like a Are you talking like the final ending?
Yeah,
like
the final ending where he just starts playing the saxophone.
Yeah.
There's something to that. Like, I kind of thought about that and a little bit of my interpretation was like the disassociation with our jobs and like our work, and like I actually kind of thought it was a little anti-capitalist. Like, I thought this movie as a whole was anti-capitalist.
I suppose so.
And the way that I kind of read it was, you know, like, this character is essentially disassociating from everything to just get by. And like, you know, suddenly I think going forward, this character is just going to, like, you know, take the job as the job and like not look into things too much deeper. Because at the end of the day, I think Harry is very compelled. And I think that, again, his obsession with capturing audio and like surveillance and everything, it will eventually bring him back into that world. Like, maybe he takes a pause from it, but I think that he's never going to question or stick his nose in places that he are beyond the scope of his job.
He's going to be a little downtrodden about things.
Yeah, and I don't know. I kind of thought about that, and I was like, I wonder if there was any intention there behind Francis Ford Coppola in saying, like, you know, that's what our jobs are doing to us. Like, they're forcing us to disassociate and like not care about the implication of what our jobs are.
Yeah, maybe. That seems like a bit of a reach.
It is a little bit, but and I kind of know it is, but I kind of wonder if there's something there. I'd love to. Talking to Francis Ford Coppola would be like an absolute dream, but
I don't know about now. But yeah, I do want to say, actually, I forgot to mention the full audio commentary for this movie with Francis Ford Coppola is on YouTube.
Really?
Really?
No
yeah.
way. I'm probably going to watch that at some point.
I watched a few minutes of it before I came over here today. Mm-hmm. The YouTube channel that uploaded it is called...
Send me a link and I'll put it in the description.
Cool. I'll send it to you right now. The YouTube channel is called Speak Film, and that's film with all caps.
Cool.
Uploaded 4 years ago. I'm sending it to you right now in our very professional group chat.
Nice. No, I honestly will come back to that at some point. Like, at this point in time, you know, it's early, it's February, but this is certainly going to be a contender for my top 5 at the end of the year.
Wow, you liked it that much.
I liked it a lot.
Okay, interesting. Well, you know what? I think Repo Man might hit my top 5.
Nice.
Yeah, so, and maybe, you know what? If you want to know the difference between me and Blake, that's it. We just described it.
I don't know about that necessarily, because, you know, you like 8.5 and I don't. Like, this is just a movie where I think
I liked There Will Be Blood and you didn't.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, I don't think that. I think there's a lot of ridiculous and silly movies, and like, you know, I've been building my top 100, and there's a lot of ridiculous and silly movies on that.
Yeah.
But I guess there was just, I think I probably maybe can focus in on things a little bit more than you sometimes. Like,
what are we talking about again?
like,
Yeah.
I don't know. There's obviously like things that I picked up on that you missed. Like, you know, the fact that the scene where Harrison Ford's character tries to take the audio from him, and then the two characters who they've been surveilling are in that area there, like that went over your head.
It sure did.
And that's such a, like, that's, like I said, that's the literal moment where I sat up in my seat and was like, I'm in.
Well,
So
you know what part of it might be too is that like I've never really vibed with mysteries.
yeah,
I don't know what it is. I just like my parents love mysteries, but like I don't know what it is, but like I just, you know, it's funny. I actually wrote a couple mystery short stories with our friend John a few months ago, and like honestly, the mystery part was almost kind of an afterthought to me.
right.
I was mostly focusing on like the characters and the jokes.
Yeah,
So that might just be a me thing.
yeah, I kind of like, you know, there's something about problem solving with a mystery and like the challenge of it. And, you know, like I'm a big fan of like puzzle kind of games.
Yeah, that's true.
And challenges like that. And I don't know that you'd be just interested in something like that. Like, you know, this is kind of an old game now. It's probably 10 years old, but there's a game called The Witness where you're essentially on an island and all you're doing is solving puzzles. And it's like 50
I think I've heard of that
hours.
game. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I was super into that game. Like I played that game religiously, and I don't know that you would connect with it at all.
No, I'd be playing The Sims and like drowning people in my pool. Yeah.
Whereas a game like that, I have zero interest in playing.
Yeah, we have different tastes in some ways.
That's kind of what it comes down to, and I guess like that's the difference between my enjoyment level of this movie and your enjoyment level.
You know what I think it is too, and I'm just kind of articulating this now. I think when things get a little too abstract, I kind of shut down a little.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm just like, fuck it.
I don't know. Like I definitely have a bullshit meter for abstract as well.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. But then at the same time, I like ambiguous endings and you don't.
Yes.
Wow. We are so complicated.
Yeah. Just full of like
contradictions.
Yes.
All
Absolutely.
right. Well, we'll crack this at some point.
Yeah, maybe during The Godfather Part 2, which we're doing next week.
Which we are indeed doing next week.
So on that note, I guess we should wrap it up here.
I guess tell your dad.
Tell your dad. He may or may not like this depending on how much he can deal with this kind of pacing.
He definitely likes Gene Hackman, though.
He definitely likes Gene Hackman.
I can guarantee you your dad likes Gene Hackman.
If he's over the age of 50.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it. That's all I got. We'll see you next week.
Tell your dad if he's over 50.
Tell your dad.
Yeah, all right.
Bye.